Welcome to this episode of A Language I Love Is, the podcast that's all about languages, linguistics, and love. I'm Danny, and this is the second episode of the show's third series. In the previous episode, we had Gretchen McCulloch telling us all about the languages of Canada in the present day. This episode, however, is instead a trip back in time, since it's all about a historical language, classical Latin. However, the genius of my guest for this episode is how he successfully brings classical Latin back to life, which he achieves through speaking it, teaching it, and making its literature feel very relatable for a modern audience. My guest is Luke Amadeus Ranieri, a linguist, teacher, YouTuber, helicopter pilot. Polymath might be the right term to accurately describe him, and polýMATHY is the name of one of his popular YouTube channels, which you might know him from. Before we get to our chat, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to A Language I Love Is and consider becoming a member of the show's new Patreon, where I'll be sharing bonus audio from my linguistic conversations. I was elated to see that several people have already joined since the last episode, and I thank them all sincerely. Now, here's Luke Ranieri discussing and speaking classical Latin.
Lugeto venere scubidinesque, et quantus hominum venus diorum, passer mortus est meae puellae, passer deliciae meae puellae.
I am just truly delighted today. I really am, because this is quite surreal to be talking to somebody whose content I devour on a regular basis, and to actually have him, sadly not with me physically, but to be talking to him is a real treat for me. I won't pretend to be anything other than starstruck as a historical linguist and as a fan of public linguistics. My guest today is Luke Ranieri. For people who love languages as I do, especially historical languages, you cannot have failed to find his wonderful, extremely accessible content on YouTube. He makes videos about two languages in particular, not only those two languages, but a lot about Latin and ancient Greek. Amidst his busy schedule and all of the projects that he's got going on, he's very kindly agreed to talk to me today about one of those languages, which I will allow Luke to introduce. Luke, first and foremost, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Danny Bate, it is an honor to be here. Thank you so much, and especially for that kind introduction. So, you want to know about Latin, do you?
Well, I want to know lots. I want to hear what you have to say. The language that you have decided to talk to us today is Latin, and we're going to specifically qualify this as classical Latin because we had a wonderful and very different episode previously in Series 1 about medieval Latin, and that was very interesting, and there was all sorts of, what makes medieval Latin medieval. We got into that, but we're going earlier back in time into this hugely important language for the linguistic scene of Europe. So, first and foremost, Luke, let's start at the very beginning. When does Latin begin? That's a hard question, maybe a vague question, but where would you place the birthday for the Latin language?
Well, might as well make it, this roughly 750s BC. That's when Rome was founded, more or less. But there are some inscriptions that are quite old, like the Lapis Niger, and then there's the 12 tablets that come a couple centuries after that. These really old things that have survived in either actual inscriptional evidence, and it's Latin that looks in some ways much more like Greek. It has like oi as the plural instead of e and those sorts of things. For example, the epitaph inscriptions for one of the Scipios, their family I think has a couple of them, and it's really interesting to see things like instead of unu, that is one, you see oino. So we have a couple things going on there. One, that a lot of in Latin come from oi. For example, punic, punicus comes from boinus from punicus. So oi becomes at a certain stage of Old Latin, which precedes Classical Latin. But to really talk about the language, that there's some fulcra that are relevant, especially date-wise. Usually putting right 100 BC as the beginning of what we like to think of as Classical Latin, as a classical period, and the beginning of that classical period is the entirety of the 1st century BC. The usual broad definitions go from all the 1st century BC, all the 1st century AD, and all the 2nd century AD is that which we call Classical Latin. And these are about the literature, so we're talking about the chronology of how this all works to the written language especially. But the spoken language is obviously very much entrained along with all of that and vice versa, which is always interesting too, because so much of our study philologically is literature-based or inscriptional-based, when linguists who get to study living modern languages have a lot more to really understand it. So much is from inference when it comes to the reality of a language, because a language is fundamentally something spoken, right, and heard. And the writing part, while really important and very interesting, is obviously ancillary to the human experience. But yeah, so what we'll say 100 BC approximately for the beginning of classical Latin, and ending somewhere around 200 AD is a good breadth, and that gives all of the major authors of antiquity that people have heard of. Cicero was born around that time, as was Caesar. They're about the same age. Cicero was, I think, about 10 years older. Cicero and Caesar are these gold standards of Latin prose, of classical Latin prose, which is useful in the sense that something that comes with this language, especially as the spoken language diverges, more and more becoming proto-versions of the Romance languages. But the written language remains the same. People learn to speak this written artificial language. Dante, back in talking of medieval Latin, he called it grammatica. That was that term that they would use, that grammatica, to speak grammatica, to speak Latin, speak the proper grammatical way instead of this, like the Florentine dialect or whatever. So the language that we think of as Latin as a written language, the basis of the medieval written Latin, as opposed to the Romance languages that they were developing in the medieval times, is based especially on this prose model of Cicero and of Caesar. Before that, the literature really starts with Plautus, a good old Plautus, who was, as far as I can recall his story, he was a slave who ended up buying his freedom, and he ended up mostly translating and writing some original plays. So he was translating from ancient Greek a lot of plays which are lost. We have a lot of his plays preserved. And I think there's 6 preserved of Terence, who was about a generation after him. They maybe overlapped a little bit. Plautus starts from 3rd to 2nd century, and 2nd century BC is Terence. Interestingly, these are really important authors in Latin, but they technically precede the classical period. So you have this late Old Latin literature, Terence and Plautus, and there's Cato the Elder. Some of his stuff has been preserved too. So what's interesting too is the manuscripts that we have are mostly updated, as far as we can tell, to more classical Latin norms in spelling, which is interesting, and also is irritating too, because where it doesn't preserve original features, especially for those of us who are interested in historical pronunciations, it could be like, why is this not like how we'd want to see? Because we do have inscriptions preserved, like the epitaph of Scipio, which shows like oino instead of unu. But you don't see any oino in the contemporaries like Plautus and Terence for those kinds of things. They wrote comedies, which is great. So they give us a lot of information on the colloquial language, at least of their time. We tend to use Plautus and Terence, especially as our models for spoken Latin today, because I and many other crazy people out there, we speak Latin and we enjoy it a lot too.
There is a kind of deeply implicit judgment in this designation of classical. This is maybe a historical and social matter in as much as a linguistic one, but I'm going to pose it as a linguistic question anyway. What do you think makes this language classical? Why does it get this hallowed status, do you think? Oh,
that's a great question. I suppose it's simply because it's, for whatever reason, the most interesting, or has taken on a kind of, it was certainly important within the cultural linguistic system of the time, for sure. And this also applies to, say, classical Greek, that 5th, 4th century BC. And what's Rome doing in the 1st century? Rome has conquered the Carthaginians, has acquired Greece and these other territories. And of course, the biggest expansion all at once, I think, is actually Caesar's of Gaul. I think that was the biggest single and shortest time period expansion. I'll double check. But that was a very, very significant growing of the Roman influence and control. You have all of that going all at the same time, and also happened to be very exciting historically. Civil wars. There were Sulla and Marius prior, and the Gracchi brothers, and then everything with Caesar. And then Cicero himself, thankfully his letters are so well preserved because they tell us so much what was going on historically, so we can put together the dots, which without those, I can't imagine us trying to understand that century better. So this golden age, like they usually call the 1st century BC, the golden age of classical Latin literature, and then the next 2 centuries, the Silver Age. Usually, like, say, the death of Augustus is the end of the golden age of Latin, which is, I think, 14-ish AD. I don't remember the exact date, but it's the early 1st century AD. So, like, why is this classical? What makes it classical? I think it's just because they became the models for everything that came after. And not that there's a lack of variation or lack of innovation after, there's certainly a lot, but they end up really fixing the language into this level of distinctness and prominence. And I wonder if one can possibly look at the modern Koine, which is English, to look at a point where this is where the language was at the peak of its influence, and imagine the language really became fixed in its spelling conventions and grammatical conventions. I dare say that's the 19th century, where you have two very powerful English-speaking countries, the Britain, of course, and the United States, casting great influence over the world, and that, of course, remains true to this day. And thus the language, the English language, it has its changes, and it's developing and evolving like every language, but literarily we look a lot of the things that we take for granted as very normal or well established, late 18th century, 19th century. So Shakespeare's in this model be like the Plautus and Terence, playwright too. And then you have we're in the middle of the equivalent classical centuries if we're using this Roman model. I don't know if that's a valid reason, but basically these were the models. Why were they the models? They had a great prestige. They were well studied, like celebrities in their own times. And then the fact that Cicero's stuff was preserved, his letters and his speeches in particular, because a lot of the stuff that has been preserved to this day, whether it's Greek literature or Latin literature that we look at and we admire, that's all they had even back then. The orators that they had from the classical Greek periods, they only had certain ones that are the same ones that we have. So they'd already taken on this kind of mythic and isolated status.
This is just so nice to hear, because it's a kind of unexpected theme that runs through so many episodes of this podcast, through completely different languages actually, but a discussion of language changing and certain forms, facets of a language coinciding with a socially great time for speakers of that language. We've had this so many times on this podcast so far, and it's nice to have this theme crop up again. I think you, the linguist side to you, Luke, can acknowledge there is nothing inherently superior of unus, classical Latin, over oinos, Old Latin. It's just unus coincides with this fascinating period when, among other things, the Romans are kind of top dog in the Mediterranean. A question that I want to pose to you is, you've mentioned the Romance languages there. The Romance languages, these are offspring of Latin that slowly emerge out from underneath the shadow of this, it's very prestigious classical language. But is classical Latin the ancestor of the Romance languages? What is being spread around the slowly forming Roman Empire? It's being spread around by traders and soldiers and sailors and politicians. What is the thing that then gives rise to the Romance language? Is it fair to call that classical Latin as well?
Oh, that's a tremendously good question. Yeah, because the strictest definition of classical Latin is a literary one, and it means the literary authors of classical Latin, which, just to rattle off some names, Caesar, Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, Catullus, Horace. Apuleius is kind of the tail end, and there's some people today, and there have been for a while, they're like, oh, Apuleius, he's too like late Latin. And I'm like, he's 2nd century. But that's just because they don't like his sense of humor, which, whatever, that's fine. I think he's fantastic, but that's a discussion for another day. But these authors, Sallust and Seneca, this is classical Latin for sure. We can point to that and say that's classical Latin. Now, surely that also means reasonably that virtually all of the urban spoken Latin from which that was born, that comes from, that was also associated with it, was fundamentally also the same language. Absolutely, I would agree with that. What's interesting too is a number of urban Latin traits that were different already from the rural Latin traits outside of Rome. So urban Latin, we mean the city of Rome, the Roman Latin specifically, end up having an influence on the Romance languages ultimately. We see that in particular with the fact that the rural Latin had already lost a lot of diphthongs. In fact, all 3, if I remember, so the I and the ow in particular, oi, most of those had flattened into monophthongs. In the 1st century BC, Cicero comments on this, and other authors, they comment, making fun of the non-city folk for saying things like plaudere, or maybe even plautus, saying plautus, or saying instead of Claudius, Claudius. Claudius was a name, a family name, against Claudius, as well as Claudius. And the distinction was that Claudius was the same name, but the one that had gone through the monophthongization in the countryside, and then, of course, influenced through the city, whereas the Claudius was retaining the older pronunciation. In this case, we have the more conservative traits in the city, interestingly, at least for the diphthongs. And also true of I becoming an eh. And if anybody knows about the development of the Western Romance languages, you're like, well, that's exactly what happened. So surely Romance languages come from the maybe population-dominant Latins outside of Rome, and not from the urban Latin, which was more conservative. While no doubt there was some effect on that, we know that isn't the case because since there was, at least this is the hypothesis that seems credible to me, if we have a full merger of, for example, au to all, which is what seems to be attested for this rural Latin, well, that would mean that long au would have closed to u in Romance languages. And think of a good example that's useful. Poco in Italian, from Latin paucum, which is, little or few. If we have poco, so that in rural Latin, we would imagine that would become paucum with a long o. Long duration o, if it's, for example, sole, the sun, that all becomes a close vowel in Western Romance. So you get il sole, the sun, with a closed u in Italian, but not poco, but poco. And all of Western Romance, including Old French, of course, mostly retains a lot of these open and closed variants, ultimately from Latin. So the point is that certain developments already were occurring that happened to be in the direction of Romance languages. So it's very tempting to look at stuff that's going on, or look at inscriptions in Pompeii, and say, look, they were doing this or weren't doing that, just like Romance. Sometimes they call that vulgar Latin, the Latin of the people. What vulgar Latin is an interesting and difficult question, because the term could be used for so many things that it's better to just say like informal Latin of the classical period, for example, to be more specific. It's easy to point at these interesting innovations that happen to resemble those in Romance and say, that's the antecedent. They could be. But the reality is that there are so many bizarre changes that happen in isolation but parallel. I've seen enough of this to dissuade me from a former point of view that I had that, this must be the common origin. Think that, maybe these could have developed entirely separately. Romanian has palatalization. It looks a lot like Italian. Some words sound almost identical to Italian. It's tempting to conclude that, when the origins of Romanian and Italian, the Proto-Italian and Romanian, were separated, say fall Western Roman Empire, circa, maybe around there, is a good time to say, since they both have palatalization, they both say che and je, for example, for ke and ge, the classical Latin pronunciations. That's definitely where they had it. Well, maybe, but Romanian went through an additional palatalization process that Italian didn't go through for things. For example, Italian has ke for what, but it's je in Romanian. So there was an additional series of palatalization that happened. And so these phenomena don't even have to have a common origin.
So your point is really that there are clearly some regional dialects of Latin, accents of Latin around at the time, but they're not necessarily the ancestor of the modern Romance languages. It could all come from, theoretically, the city of Rome itself.
I think the best explanation, if we want to go backwards from Romance to late Roman Empire, the Romance languages come primarily and especially fundamentally from middle class spoken language of the Western Romans, and also, of course, the Romans on the East. And that's where it comes from. Now, how well did those people speak? How literate were they? They're probably semi-literate because they were businessmen or they were merchants, but they weren't necessarily scholars. And then there's people, because people have often thought, the language of the poorest in Rome or the slaves and so forth, that's the origin of Romance languages, and probably not just due to the lack of their influence. The influence was mostly from this merchant sort of class, if you will. We would consider, like the modern terminology, something like middle class, not elites and not the poorest. So therefore getting influence, both innovations from above and below, as well as maybe conservative traits from above and below. And that merchant class Latin was just the lingua franca, coming from centuries of influence from the city of Rome itself, and rural Latin speakers, and Latin italic language speakers.
And from other languages too, from languages not of the Italian peninsula. I know that, they may not appear in the classical language so much, but the Romance languages get a lot of words from Gaulish, for example, which is Celtic, and they're sort of on the scene. And it kind of makes sense that if you're a scholar or an orator in the Roman Senate, you probably wouldn't use a Gaulish word. That would be, you'd look down on that rather. But if you're a merchant and the Gauls have a term for some, I don't know, piece of jewelry or some kind of horse, kabbalos, for example, this word, special word for horse. I don't know. My Gaulish is a little rusty, but it's something like that. It makes sense that these are the people who are then laying the foundations for what will become the Romance languages. And the idea especially that this family of languages could have started off as no more than accents, basically, in the same way that you and I, Luke, have different accents. We may have the seeds of future languages if the social conditions will allow it to happen. You've been very good and very precise about defining classical Latin there, but nonetheless, amongst all these wonderful texts that the Romans have left us, people like yourself have been very invested in finding out how these sounded. For example, what the sounds of the Latin language were at this time. So could you give us a sense of, well, what did Latin sound like in general, and how today do we go about knowing that?
Arma virumque cano Troia qui primus aboris, si Italian fato profugus, la vigna que venit litora. That's the beginning of the Aeneid. I was just met with a student today and said, you might want to memorize this just because it's fun to be able to bring that out at parties, I
like the sound of your parties.
Well, yeah, if there's Latin speakers there, it tends to go over well, I guess. Or maybe actually it's so boring it'd be like, to be or not to be. Okay, yeah, and what? Who cares? Yeah, so that's just a bit of the sound of classical Latin. Every aspect about a language is curious and worthy of study, in my opinion, including in every detail of phonology. But I live in these different worlds of this high precision where I read these 600, 800-page books, plural, by J.N. Adams, if you know him. I have them actually back behind me here that are like the social variation of the Latin language and, the regional diversification of Latin. These great texts that go into so much detail to try to understand from the evidence that remains to us the sounds as they were and how they changed. And all of that is fascinating. But what is most important about classical Latin, and in reality later forms of Latin too, to appreciate the literature, I would say, is the phonemic vowel length as well as the phonemic syllable length, so double consonants and things like that. Some characteristics are shared with Italian, like the double consonant thing, but being able to have a word like I said in the first line of the Aeneid there, canno, which means I sing. And Italian, using Italian phonology, and this goes for actually a lot of people who speak Western European languages, would not say cano, they would say cano. They would actually reverse the lengths, making the stressed syllable long and the unstressed one short. That was an inevitable development of the Latin language into, of course, late Latin and also into Romance. And many languages certainly go that way, where the stress accent ends up lengthening the syllable. It's a very normal thing to happen. But it hadn't occurred yet for classical Latin. And for that reason, we get some of the best poetry that's ever been written. And I mean from the inherent rhythm of the language, plus the metrical structures make something that I think is just the best. But we'll talk more about that later. So that's so significant because when you have Cicero, who's railing against Catiline, who says, quousque butere Catilina patientia nostra, and you have these long vowels that are in there. And what he was doing too, of course, the Greeks, since they invented everything, they also invented how to do oratory. They figured this out first. And what Cicero was doing, which was to have an arrangement, we'll call it a clever arrangement, of long and short syllables with the words that you already want to say. Maybe you're adding a word here or there, or just reversing the order in ways that one could, that still work for getting your point across. In order to have a rhythm in prose, in spoken prose, but also written prose, which is the crazy thing, that has an effect on the listener. To have that, the way that famous speakers in, say, English, and probably one of our most famous on our side of the pond is Martin Luther King Jr., who was so good at captivating and inspiring his audience through the rhythm of his speech. Of course, he studied rhetoric, too. It's obvious because of how he uses chiasmus and uses anaphora. He uses all these great rhetorical devices, these repetitions that move the audience And also what they do is they end up persuading the audience or getting the audience's attention because they have this musical or rhythmic effect. Now, why that's so interesting and important in Latin is if one is not dealing with the language without that consideration, you're missing one of the most important elements that, say, Cicero in this case, or Sallust, or Livy, was trying to put into their written works because they expected, especially with a book, we think of a book, we read it silently. They didn't do that very often in antiquity, and books were expensive. So usually you'd go to the library. You can imagine the scholars going to a library like the Library of Alexandria or the Trajan's Library, the Ulpian libraries in Rome, and they're the group of scholar friends, but there's only one book. So one of them would read the text to the others. Most books were probably read in this way. That is, as audiobooks. Most people were probably listening to these things and knowing rather than reading them, but that's how they would experience or quote unquote read the book, from hearing one of their friends do it. And then it was their turn, they would recite it aloud for everybody to hear. That's such a key part of the literary experience. And I focus on that a lot because while I am very much into the studying every detail as much as I can, and also, and to the best I can try to, with my non-native accent to try to render it how I think it sounded. The most important thing I'd say for people to concentrate on is that phonemic vowel length and syllable length in order to appreciate that. And that's also a really important characteristic of classical Latin that was native to it. Later forms of Latin, like literary, medieval, and Renaissance Latin, that was still in the literature, but it wasn't part of how anybody was probably speaking it if they were like doing legal conversations or treaties or merchants or things like that. That's the most important part of the sound of ancient Latin, to answer your question.
Luke, I mean, that was just a tour de force explanation of the sounds of the language. And you've really, I don't know, just sat here listening to you, kind of unlocked a new appreciation for the spokenness of the language, not just as a linguist and someone who likes sounds in general, as I do, but also just how classical Latin for us today is primarily a written thing. It has to be, because of the fact that sounds are not permanent, they disappear into the air, and the fact is that's what we have for this language. But at the time when it existed, the written form was not the primary expression of this language. It was, in fact, speech. Even if it wasn't what, say, the lower classes, your merchants and sailors were speaking, even if it had that sort of, shall we say, grandiosity to it, what Cicero is doing, nonetheless, classical Latin still exists first and foremost as a spoken system, spoken thing. Is that a fair summary of what you're trying to say there?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. And I love looking at, say, Pompeian inscriptions and things like that to see how the language is changing or developing. And I can pick out a couple examples of stuff that's from that time period. But essentially, you have the language as it's written is as it's spoken in the time period. And for sure, there could be differences. Obviously, there's registers. The stuff we get that's written down, that's part of the classical Latin corpus of literature, is obviously of the elites, the people who are educated enough to write and have the time, the otium, the leisure. Otium is the Latin calque of scholae. And scholae means leisure or free time, which gives us school. So otium is school or study, leisure time, because you're not working in the fields or doing the hard manual labor, building edifices. So yeah, absolutely. There's, in fact, I like to dispel a notion that comes up that people just assume to be true. Sometimes this is heard in Romance language communities if they have some thoughts that maybe they picked up about Latin in antiquity. They think, oh no, that no one actually spoke that way. That was an artificial, written language only. But they really just spoke something that was almost like Italian or Spanish or something like that. And they're wrong, because we have plenty of informal Latin examples that demonstrate extraordinary adherence to the exact same principles, phonology, vocabulary. Doesn't mean they lack differences. This is actually probably a good comparison. You and I are both speaking a medium formal version of English right now, but I could probably come up with, some more casual things I might say to closer friends in a yet more relaxed atmosphere, as you could too. Our pronunciation might change a little bit. Some certain vocabulary, especially if it's regionally derived. My go-to, which has nothing to do with my own accent because I'm from Pennsylvania, but is that sort of typical New York City accent. Hey, what you do? What's going on? Yeah, and I can only do a parody of it. But that, there's so much variety once we go just a little bit below this And above, this register that you and I are using now, and we would both think of this, this is the English, an American accent, a British accent, but virtually the same and the same kinds of vocabulary. And if you go higher register, you probably get even more unity. But what do you get? You might get some theatrical performances. It doesn't get too much more, like higher register than what we're already doing. But this is also kind of low. But you can go into all kinds of beautiful and fascinating depths into the accents, estuary English, southern United States English, the Western Rockies accents. You go to North England, you go into Scotland and Ireland, all these incredible places and variety, and you hear all these different things. Of course, one could easily consider Scots to be its own language, for example. So all these things are there and possible and developing and evolving, in spite of what we're doing. So I think one could think of it that way, that there, all kinds of other stuff surely was going on, but the normalish language that you and I are speaking, we consider this to be how Cicero was writing his letters, for example. Probably that's a good model. And that's therefore a very appropriate way to think of. That's what the language was mostly like.
I think that's a good default assumption, rather than to think of ancient Rome as somehow monolithic in its language. That's to just presume that, like we are today, the Romans were capable of extraordinary variation and diversity in their language, not just across the empire, but within a single individual. That, Cicero could probably sound a bit casual and cheeky when he's, reclining at dinner. But when he's in the Senate, it's something different, but still within general perception, it's still recognizably part of the same language. Just as I could go even posher than I'm currently speaking, as my friends would tell me. There are further levels above that, and I think you've illustrated that very nicely. I'd like to ask you now the first of my 3 questions. These are our chances to get to know you a little bit better beyond what you've already told us about yourself. The first of the 3 questions is, what is your relationship to this language that you've chosen, which today is Classical Latin? And I think this will really interest people. Your relationship to linguistics has gone on an interesting route, which perhaps involves more aircraft than the average linguist. I don't want to give the game away, but tell us about your journey to loving Latin.
With Latin, I think it ultimately derives from my late father, he was an artist. His parents were from Italy. But among his siblings, he was the only one who really became fascinated with his origins in that sense. As an artist, of course, he was most fascinated with the architecture, with the sculpture, with the paintings that exist certainly from Renaissance Italy, but also from antiquity, those ancient models, and from Greece too. And he knew a lot about them. He taught art history. So from a young age, I was of course curious about his art books he would have open when he was preparing to teach a class at the college. And so I would, I think that's where it started for me. And of course he spoke Italian, and I wanted to learn Italian, and I did. And we spent, on a number of occasions, we spoke Italian together, and he studied art in Rome. Even though his parents were from Italy, he would grow up just at World War II. So it was like, oh, let's not speak the language of the enemy. Let's learn English, his parents instructed their children wisely. So he grew up just speaking, of course, English, but he learned Italian as an adult when he was studying art in Rome. So that was a big deal for him, and ended up thus becoming a big deal for me. And I always just wanted to learn Latin, and I finally did. I learned Italian first. I studied abroad in Florence as second year of university. At the same time, I was like, wow, look at all these Latin inscriptions around the city, or in Rome, which I got to visit at the time. I was like, I want to learn Latin. And I Googled it. This is 2005. We call this the old Latin period of the internet, where you could in fact Google things. But I found that wonderful series called Lingua Latina per se illustrata by Hans Warburg, and that I got that first main volume of it called Familia Romana, and I realized, this is so much better than those boring grammar books. This is like learning a modern language. And so I consumed it, and I decided I'm going to transcribe all of it and speak it aloud, and that was a hugely useful thing. I would say a sentence aloud, and I would hear myself, and then I would write it, and I was getting all 4 language learning disciplines, as they say, the reading, the writing, the speaking, and the listening at once every time. And after 3 months, I had transcribed the book and done, I can't believe that was 20 years ago, and I had a lot more energy then, I guess, to do those kinds of things, because I can't imagine having the free time to do that now. But such are the summers when you're a second-year university student and working at library circulation, and you have nothing better to do. What beautiful times. That's how I acquired the Latin language in that crash and sense, through that doing every exercise and everything in that first volume. And so I felt very comfortable by the end in even of translating my conversational Italian skills into conversational Latin skills based on the models I had. My goal was to speak Latin. Like, I wanted to speak Latin, and I was like, "What? This is boring. These books, like, they're grammar translation books. They're not bad, but they just weren't what I was looking for, like Huilax Latin or a number of these other traditional textbooks, and didn't appeal to me at all. I don't want to do it. I'm translate into English. That's boring. I want to speak it." So my goal is to speak the language fundamentally, to bring it alive. And then thus I discovered many things along the way. One, I've realized I loved literature, something I didn't have any idea about before. I fell in love with Latin literature, especially the poetry, but all of it. And it just made me so excited in ways that I had never anticipated before. And while I was doing other things with my life and career, studying geology, aviation, and things like that, ultimately the thing I loved most and came back to was teaching other people to of course, learning these languages, Latin and ancient Greek, teaching them how to love them, and and letting them know when you get to this point, you're going to be really excited and love it. And often it's true for a lot of these people who stick with it. So that's my relationship with it. It became something that I started speaking. I found colleagues who are friends to this day. Stefano Vittori is one of these tremendous colleagues who is a poet and an author and speaks Latin better than pretty much anybody else alive. This community of Latin speakers who are out there, who of course are just in love with the literature, that really had an interesting effect on me. So the personal relationship, I suppose, I have with it is an origin that starts with a curiosity about it and leading into a perennial hobby that then became my in a way of my life and career, and I'm really happy for that.
All credit to you as well. It truly is a relationship of love, and you've just invested so much time and passion, and it shows. It really shows. Your enthusiasm is infectious. I'm just smiling here, to be honest. And I do wonder as well, I mean, it's a crude distinction, but with languages, it's possible to know a language, as we say in English, and possible to also to know about it, to know in the abstract, to know things about its phonology, its word order, the things which I would describe as linguistics. Where does that come in? Has that always been a part of your relationship to Latin, or did that perhaps come a bit later?
I wonder where it began. There's a set of books, a couple of them by Sidney Allen. There's Vox Graeca and Vox Latina. He talks about the phonology of the classical languages of both and some other things. I got that early. I think I've had my copy of both for 20 years, actually 20 years since I started studying them, back when I was a college student. Yeah, I think that started pretty early with those languages. And there's so many better phoneticians than I, even, certainly for Latin and all languages. But my curiosity, my interest in it, definitely far exceeds my grasp of realizing any of the things when it comes to phonology, when it comes to consistency. And we're talking about the suppression of my native accents when rendering these things. And I could comment exactly what those are. But yeah, I think they've always been quite tight in learning about the language as well as acquiring it, to use the Krashen terms. And it took learning about the importance of, for example, as a teacher, not imposing the fun curiosities about the language unless they're truly entertaining on students, especially beginners, because they have so much to do. I knew Italian really before I started Latin. So I have this, in addition to English, which is all this rich Latin vocabulary, and this Romance languages that's derived from it. And I realized it's important not to overemphasize the learning about stuff when the acquisition or the learning of the language more fundamentally is more key. So I usually try to monitor myself, and I let my students know too, like, let me know if this is too much in the weeds or too nerdy, or don't really concentrate on that thing I just said about, aspirates and vowel height. Just learn how to read this sentence and you'll be fine.
Yes, just let the enthusiasm wash over you, and if some of it's useful, if some of it sticks, then that's great. So the second question, as always, is awful, I think, from the perspective of the guest, because you've amply demonstrated your deep, deep knowledge and enthusiasm for Latin so far. It's truly impressive, and I appreciate that you might not feel it. You might feel like there's always more to do, but from the outside, it just looks wonderful. Amidst all of that, could you find for us something that you just love about Latin, a single facet of this language that you'd like to share with us today?
Yes, that's the poetry. And that's actually pretty easy. And I realized that early on, that wonderful book, Familia Romana, the last chapter, introduces you to poetry. And it does it in this relaxing way with this little, short bits, or maybe whole poems if they're short, like by Catullus and Ovid. And it really gets you started. And then what's even better, too, is at the end of the chapter, it explains the syllable lengths and how this is how the meter works. I didn't know anything about that. It was so fun to learn about it in Latin, too, from this book that was teaching me. I found that very exciting. But to then experience those rhythms, like one of the first poems that's in there is the one by Catullus, which is about, at least superficially, it's about the dead pet sparrow. The domestic sparrow was an extinct species or subspecies of the European sparrow that the Romans had as pets, which, like dormice, they don't exist anymore. This was Lesbia, the fictitious name of this real person that Catullus was in love with. We're pretty sure, scholars are sure, it was this married woman, and I can't remember her name at the moment, but the point is that the poem has all these things in it. It's about this, their pet, which is a sparrow, is dead, and it's moving, and also this rhythm that goes along with it. And hopefully out there in the audience, you can hear these long and short syllables that are really, I find really cool. Another poem that's in that, these first poems that I was exposed to that really started moving with the rhythm was No nego nobilium sedeo studiosus sequorum, cui tamen ipsa faves, vincat utile precor. And that's Ovid's poem from the Amores, where he's sitting with his girlfriend who likes the horse races, but he's, of course, a nerdy poet and he doesn't care about them. But he's saying, I'm not here because I'm interested in the horses, honey. I'm here because I get to be with you and sit with you and talk with you. And whoever you want to win, I hope he wins. That's what the poem is about. And it's this lovely, there's something very romantic, and I found it immediately gripping in the sense that these are extremely real human emotions. If one reads Caesar, when you read about all that death and conquest, enslavement and glory and riches and new lands. I mean, I'm trying to not color it all as completely negative, though. I think it's reasonably, from a modern perspective, to question the goodness of all of those events, if we wish to judge them moralistically. But that can as a kid, I don't know. I have this character, the Legionarius, Rufus, who I have turned into something which I like. And that is because when I was a kid, I remember, having some fascination with ancient Rome, like a lot of kids do, and thinking about the legionaries, I'm like, oh, that counts, that cool thing that I guess boys inherently like, a lot of boys do. And I certainly found that to be an interesting thing that I was like, oh, that's cool. Yeah. And how does the Roman legion work? And then I got to this point. At this point, I was, second year college student when I started with Latin. And already those themes, those martial themes, were so much less interesting to me. And yeah, I could read Caesar, but I found it so boring suddenly. But when I was a kid, I was reading him in translation in English because I was so fascinated. And what a change. And that's everybody changes, I suppose, in ways like that. And I guess I realized I was becoming more of an adult, more mature, although those topics can be interesting to anyone. And I do appreciate Caesar a lot, but I really was attracted to this. Here are these normal people having these very normal human emotions who wanted anybody else to read them. And anybody today, 2,000 years removed, can feel like they're sitting next to Cicero and he's leaning over his shoulder to tell you this thing that he's expressing about his lady friend that he's sitting next to. Amazing. And you're there. Suddenly you have this human and relatable experience. And you feel like, wow, this bridge over 2,000 years into like it was your friends telling you today. You had poets in the past few hundred years, including ones that I know today, writing original poems. I read a couple myself, which aren't very good, but I'm still proud of doing that because I feel like I've come down to the river this great stream of flow of Latinity, and I've dipped my foot in, and I've become a part of this. If you come upon a river, and I live in the country, so this is something that can happen. Oh, wow, there's a river here. And you come to it in the forest, and you come to it, and did you know it was a river? You thought, like, oh, it's a little stream. No, it's this vast river that goes miles and miles. And suddenly you're in the flow of that. And you realize, wow, that incredible distance that this can travel. And so I enjoy penning my thoughts and my ideas and like that Latin podcast I do in these ancient languages, because who knows if any of that will actually be preserved. But I like participating in the tradition, the recording of humanity that so many much better authors than me in this century or in others have done, but still participating in it, because I find that really exciting that anyone can be a part of it. And this is why the poetry moves me, I think, most of all, because of the themes that most of the poems convey, especially the Latin ones, and in particular, I mean, the language itself. And just to finish up that, I think this is where Latin truly beats out ancient Greek. The ancient Greek poetry is tremendous, amazing, but I think the Latin poetry is better. And I'll stop there, and in case we want to explore that later or in a different episode, we can.
So, the third and final question, which I would love to pose to you today, is what's your takeaway point? Let's give the listeners something to keep in their hearts as they now go out into the world, having been successfully enthused by you about classical Latin.
Anybody can learn Latin, and it's worth it. It's part and parcel, I feel, with the patrimony of humanity. Among, of course, many other languages. I'm happen to know this one well, and therefore I know its importance and influence. Specifically, how much history is written in Latin. I mean, talking about most of the literature, in fact, that most Latin literature that's actually written down is post-Roman. It's medieval, it's Renaissance, because of how much has been preserved. Although one could easily make a career out of doing, one could spend decades just reading the classical Latin. There's so much. That, I think, is truly, truly amazing about it, that it gives you access to so much. I think translation is a very valuable tool. That's something I've come to appreciate more and more in recent years. Some people like to not, deal with translation because they, like me, they didn't want to translate. They're not interested in the art of translation. I respect it, but I don't as interested as into translating Latin into English, for example. I'd rather, be reading it. While the translation is certainly an adequate way. Like if we want to read the Aeneid, but you don't know Latin yet, and you're just really fascinated, should you read some of it in English? I'd say yes. Actually, I'd say do yourself one better. Read a few lines of it in English in the translation, and then read the Latin out loud. Will you understand it because you're a beginner? No. But when I learned Japanese, I watched anime. I didn't have any Japanese. I could kind of read the hiragana, and that was all I could do. But I wanted to acquire this language, and I would watch the anime, and I have English subtitles. And I picked up a lot of colloquial expressions from that, a lot of grammar after watching hours and hours and hours. So I'd throw out this recommendation to people who want to get started. While I recommended some things that I use, you don't have to use those. In fact, I've started saying this because the journey can be long and it can be arduous, and one can work so long in one of these either readers or textbooks and feel like, I would like to read the Aeneid, but I can't really understand it yet, for the case of, say, Latin or Horace or Ovid. I'd say there are free translations online, like the Perseus website has all these great, mostly 19th century translations of everything, Latin and Greek. Read a paragraph or a strophe, whatever is available, whatever you're trying to read. It could be Cicero or Caesar. Read it aloud, a bit in the English, and then read aloud the Latin. And there's ways you can go about that. And I think the best way to go about it, the minimum way is to read the English, then read the Latin aloud. Thus, you become, in the analogy of that anime TV show, you're giving the voice to the author. That you are getting to hear the sound of Latin that you are then producing on behalf of the author who can't speak with his own living voice. But you can do that for him, or for her in the case of the few classical poets or authors we have who are in fact women, and make that input come alive. So you're getting the input. And if you do this every day, you're going to learn a lot of the language. So the most important takeaway is this is really worth learning. And I think a lot of people should, who otherwise might have felt, oh, I don't have the time, or I don't have this advantage. I would say just that is probably the lowest bar of entry. And it is really worthwhile. And then if you like it, read that Latin version again. You don't quite remember every bit, well, then glance at the English again. And then you read it so much that you, in a way, memorize the meaning of everything, even though the details aren't quite clear yet. But guess what? If you were tossed into Rome today and you don't speak Italian, this happened to my father, he acquired, after 2 years, spoken Italian, just hearing it and trying to work with it in that way. And it really works. So I guess that's my main takeaway. It's worth learning. Anybody can do it.
Very nice. A great message to impart to people, and extremely appropriate for this podcast as well. So I appreciate that doubly. Luke, to end this, I usually get my guests to, say, well, where can people find more from you? Where can people find your output? I think it's safe to say you're not difficult to find online. You've put a lot of great content out there. If you were to point listeners to one particular piece of content that is a great introduction to you and to Latin, where would you direct them to?
I guess polýMATHY, I have a number of videos on polýMATHY that are in English, so you don't necessarily need that. So if you just want to learn, if you like, especially if you're a fan in particular of this podcast and the pronunciation things I talk about with Latin and some other ones. I did one about the syntax of Latin word order recently on the polýMATHY channel. That'd be good. But if you want something a little bit more fun, I would go to ScorpioMartianus for the various songs that I've performed, either alone or with some of my colleagues, either translated by me or by friends into Latin, like Hellfire, that one where translated by Stefano Vittori, and then I was able to sing in Latin. Are some others, Disney songs there, The Nightmare Before Christmas, many of those songs we did. That's fun, and that tends to have a very welcoming effect.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, those have gone viral, I think. At least Hellfire did. It was a hit. For what it's worth, I heartily endorse all of the above. It's all good stuff. I watched this. I think I haven't missed a video in a while. Especially the Latin syntax. When that landed on my YouTube, I thought, okay, this is my cup of tea. Luke, that was a tour de force. That was absolutely incredible, all the information that you just gave us. So on behalf of everybody listening, just thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Gratias et tibio, Daniel, et gratias omnibus auscultatoribus.
There has very nicely set me up for a final fun fact and a bit of Latin etymology. Perhaps too nicely, as it's difficult for me to choose just one thing. He mentioned, for example, the Roman concept of ortium, the leisure of their society's elite, and the negative or opposite of ortium was nec ortium or negortium as one word. This means business or employment in Latin, and it's the origin of English negotiate. Sticking with that same Latin negative element, nec, which on its own means and not or nor, it can be found at the start of the verb neglegere, meaning to overlook, perhaps very literally to not pick up. Neglegere has given us neglect. Nec may also have been behind the verb negare, which means to say no or to refuse, and it's the origin of deny, specifically the second half of deny. The first bit is a prefix. Negare has given English more words besides just deny. It's given English, for example, negate, negative, and also, via Spanish, a term that originally was used for someone who rejects their religion, but now is somebody who denies a society or the law, a renegade. So, negotiate, neglect, deny, renegade, negate, negative, all connected by one little piece of Latin. That's all for this episode of A Language I Love It. My thanks go, of course, to my guest today, Luke, for generously sharing his knowledge and plenty of his time with us, and also to the podcast's first few supporters on Patreon. Thank you all for backing the show. My thanks also go to you, dear listener, for listening. Until the next time, keep well and keep loving language.